Music has always borrowed from itself. A chord progression here, a melody there. It's practically a tradition as old as music itself. But sometimes the borrowing goes a little too far, and what started as inspiration starts looking a lot like imitation. The 1960s were one of the most creatively explosive decades in popular music history, and yet some of its most beloved songs carry a story most listeners never knew. Today, we're counting down the top 10 songs from the 1960s that rip off other songs. Number 10. He's So Fine by the Chiffons. In 1963, the Chiffons released He's So Fine, a bright, catchy pop hit that shot straight to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Written by Ronnie Mac, who died just months after the song became a hit, the track was built around a simple but instantly memorable melodic motif, 2 bars that repeated themselves in a way that made the song almost impossible to forget once you'd heard it. It stayed at number 1 for 4 weeks, and became one of the defining girl group recordings of the era.
He's so fine.
Nearly a decade later, that melody would end up at the center of one of the most famous copyright disputes in music history. The case involved George Harrison's 1970 solo hit, My Sweet Lord, which shared a strikingly similar melodic structure with He's So Fine, particularly in the verses. The similarity was noticed almost immediately after Harrison's song was released, and the owner of the rights to He's So Fine, a music publisher named Bright Tunes Music, filed suit against Harrison in 1971. The legal proceedings stretched across years and took an unusual turn when Alan Klein, who had formerly managed both the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, purchased the rights to He's So Fine, while simultaneously acting in a role connected to Harrison's affairs. That conflict of interest added a complicated legal dimension to the case that extended the proceedings even further. In 1976, Judge Richard Owen ruled that Harrison had committed what he called subconscious plagiarism, meaning Harrison had not deliberately copied the song, but the melody had lodged itself somewhere in his memory from hearing it years earlier and resurfaced during composition without his awareness. It was a landmark legal decision that formally introduced the concept of unconscious infringement into copyright law. Harrison was found liable and ordered to pay damages. Harrison acknowledged the similarity in interviews and wrote about the experience in his autobiography. He described the episode as a painful lesson, and how memory and creativity could blur together in ways a songwriter might not even notice. The case permanently changed how courts and musicians approach the line between inspiration and imitation, and its precedent is still referenced in music copyright law today.
He's so fine.
Number 9. Surfin' USA by the Beach Boys. When Surfin' USA was released by the Beach Boys in 1963, it became the group's first major national hit, peaking at number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. It captured a California summer spirit that resonated with young audiences from coast to coast and helped establish the surf rock genre as a mainstream commercial force.
Surfin' USA.
The problem was impossible to ignore. The melody was lifted almost entirely from Chuck Berry's 1958 hit Sweet Little 16. Brian Wilson had written new lyrics and shifted the theme to surfing culture and specific California beaches. But the musical structure was essentially the same song with different words placed on top of it. The chord progression, the rhythm, the phrasing, it all mapped directly onto Berry's original. Chuck Berry's publisher Arc Music filed a lawsuit. The case was settled out of court, and from that point forward, the songwriting credit on Surfin' USA was changed to list Chuck Berry as the sole writer. All royalties from the song were redirected to Berry. Capitol Records, which had released the album, was also required to acknowledge the situation. Brian Wilson has confirmed in interviews that he wrote the song as a conscious adaptation of Sweet Little 16, and has expressed regret about not giving Berry credit from the start. He has described it as a mistake made in the excitement of early success, at a time when the group was still learning the business side of the music industry.
We're waxing down our surfboard. We can't wait for June.
It remains one of the most straightforward and well-documented cases of uncredited musical borrowing in 1960s pop, and it permanently altered the songwriting credit on one of the decade's most iconic summer records. Berry's insistence on proper credit set an important precedent for how the industry handled similar disputes in the years that followed.
Surfing USA.
Number 8, Come Together by the Beatles. Come Together was released by the Beatles in September 1969 as the opening track of their Abbey Road album. Written by John Lennon, the song carried a murky, swampy groove and became one of the most recognizable recordings of the era. Lennon originally wrote it as a campaign song for Timothy Leary's 1969 California gubernatorial run, though the political context never materialized into anything formal, and the song evolved into something far removed from its original purpose.
Come together right now.
Chuck Berry's 1956 track You Can't Catch Me sits at the center of this story. The song shares a closely similar opening lyrical structure and rhythmic feel with Come Together. Music publisher Morris Levy, who controlled the rights to the Berry song through his Big Seven music publishing company, noticed the resemblance almost immediately after the Abbey Road album was released and threatened legal action against Lennon.
You can't get me. Baby, you can't.
Rather than go to court, Lennon reached an agreement with Levy to record and release 3 songs from Levy's publishing catalog. That arrangement eventually led to Lennon's 1975 album Rock and Roll, which included a cover of You Can't Catch Me alongside other rock and roll classics from the era. The settlement itself later became deeply contentious. Levy began selling a bootleg version of early session recordings from the album before it was officially released, which prompted Lennon to file a countersuit. The resulting legal battle between the two parties dragged on for years and became one of the more complicated footnotes in Lennon's solo career.
Come together right now.
Lennon publicly acknowledged the connection to the Chuck Berry song, noting that he had been consciously reworking it when writing Come Together. He was candid about having drawn directly from Berry's track as a starting point, which made this case somewhat unusual. Most artists in similar situations disputed the similarity, while Lennon essentially confirmed it from the beginning. The case stands as one of the clearest examples on this list of a musician knowingly drawing from an existing work without obtaining clearance beforehand.
Got to be good looking 'cause he's so hard to see.
Number 7. Good Vibrations by the Beach Boys. Few songs from the 1960s carry the reputation that Good Vibrations does. Released in October 1966, it was a groundbreaking production achievement by Brian Wilson, a multi-layered recording assembled across dozens of studio sessions at 4 different facilities over a period of roughly 6 months. The cost of production was famously reported at around $50,000, an extraordinary sum for a single record at the time. It reached number 1 in both the United States and the United Kingdom, and is widely regarded as one of the most ambitious pop recordings ever made. However, the song's overall sonic atmosphere and emotional architecture drew strong comparisons to the production style of Phil Spector. And more specifically, the chord movement and structural feel bore close resemblance to You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' by the Righteous Brothers, which Spector had produced in 1964. The layered vocal arrangements, the dramatic shifts in mood and texture, and the overall sense of scale were all qualities that Spector had been developing and that Wilson was clearly absorbing and redeploying. Brian Wilson has openly and repeatedly cited Spector's wall of sound production technique as a direct influence on his work throughout the mid-1960s. He studied Spector's methods carefully and made no secret of how much he was drawing from that template. No lawsuit was filed in connection with Good Vibrations, and the line between genuine homage and outright borrowing is genuinely blurry in this case. But critics and music historians have consistently noted how closely Wilson was operating within Spector's sonic framework during this period. And the degree of similarity between the two artists' output in the mid-1960s raised serious questions about where one creative vision ended and another began. Number 6. Hanky Panky by Tommy James and the Shondells. Hanky Panky reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the summer of 1966, launching Tommy James and the Shondells into national prominence almost overnight. The song had originally been recorded 2 years earlier in 1964, but gained its wide commercial release in 1966 after a DJ at a Pittsburgh radio station discovered a limited local pressing and began playing it heavily, generating enough regional buzz to attract the attention of a major label. The song was written by Jeff Barry and Ellie Greenwich, two of the most successful songwriting partners of the early 1960s, also responsible for hits including Da Do Ron Ron and Be My Baby. Both of those songs were produced by Phil Spector and became defining recordings of the girl group era. While Hanky Panky was an original composition in the legal sense, its structure, production approach, and overall sound drew so heavily from the Brill building pop formula, and specifically from the feel of early Crystals recordings, that multiple contemporaries noted its strongly derivative quality upon release. No formal legal action was brought against the song. However, music historians have consistently grouped Hanky Panky among the wave of mid-1960s records constructed almost entirely from a template already established by Spector-produced girl group recordings. The chord changes, the call and response vocal phrasing, and the rhythm pattern were widely recognized at the time as direct replications of a production and songwriting style that had been pioneered just a few years earlier. Barry and Greenwich were working from their own established methods, but the result was a song that owed its entire identity to a sound someone else had built first. Number 5. My Generation by The Who. Released in October 1965 in the United Kingdom, My Generation by The Who became an anthem of youth frustration and restless energy almost immediately upon release. Pete Townshend's stuttering vocal approach, reportedly inspired by the speech patterns of people with certain speech impediments, which later drew its own controversy, and the song's raw, driven sound made it one of the defining British invasion records of the decade. It reached number 2 on the UK singles chart and remains one of the most cited examples of rock music as generational statement. The song's chord progression and rhythmic drive bore a close structural resemblance to Young Man Blues, a 1957 recording by jazz and blues musician Mose Allison. Allison's original was a slow, sardonic blues piece, and while The Who transformed the tempo and energy considerably, the underlying harmonic movement and the general defiant spirit of the composition had a clear connection to what Allison had written. Allison's influence on British rock musicians during the 1960s was thoroughly documented. Townshend cited him openly and specifically as an influence in multiple interviews, as did members of the Rolling Stones, the Yardbirds, and several other prominent British acts of the era.
Well, a young man ain't nothing in this world these days.
No legal action was ever taken in connection with My Generation. Pete Townshend has been straightforward in interviews about how deeply Allison's work shaped The Who's early musical thinking, treating the debt as a point of artistic lineage rather than a controversy to be denied. The band later recorded their own full version of Young Man Blues for their celebrated 1970 live album Live It Leads, which many observers interpreted as both a public tribute and an explicit acknowledgement of the musical debt owed to Allison. The structural similarities between the two songs remain a standard reference point in musicological discussions about the American blues and jazz roots of British rock. Number 4. Light My Fire by The Doors. Light My Fire was released by The Doors in the spring of 1967 and became their first number 1 single. spending 3 weeks at the top of the Billboard Hot 100. The song was primarily written by guitarist Robbie Krieger during the band's very early rehearsals. Jim Morrison had challenged each band member to write a complete song, and Light My Fire was Krieger's contribution. The band then collectively shaped it into the extended modal piece it became on the record. The chord progression in the verse section closely mirrors that of Hit the Road Jack, written by Percy Mayfield and recorded by Ray Charles in 1961. The specific movement between the A minor and G major chords, combined with a comparable rhythmic underpinning, drew comparisons that music scholars have continued to document for decades. Hit the Road Jack had been a #1 hit just 6 years before Light My Fire was written, making it very much part of the recent musical landscape that Krieger and the rest of the band had grown up absorbing. Beyond that harmonic parallel, the song's extended modal structure and its long improvisational instrumental break, which could stretch to over 7 minutes in live performance, owe a clear debt to the jazz influences that Jim Morrison and keyboardist Ray Manzarek frequently cited, particularly the modal jazz work of John Coltrane and his landmark 1960 album, My Favorite Things. No legal dispute ever arose from Light My Fire, and the song is generally discussed in terms of its innovations rather than its debts, but the combination of harmonic borrowing from rhythm and blues and structural borrowing from jazz has been part of the academic record on the song for many years, and Robbie Krieger has spoken candidly in interviews about the wide range of influences that converged when he sat down and wrote it. Number 3. Whole Lotta Love by Led Zeppelin. Though Led Zeppelin formed in 1968, Whole Lotta Love was released in November 1969 and falls within the decade covered by this list. It became one of the band's most recognizable tracks, featured on their second album Led Zeppelin II, and was released as a single in the United States, where it reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. The song borrowed substantially in structure, in lyrical content, and in overall feel from You Need Love, a track recorded by Muddy Waters in 1962 and written by Willie Dixon. Dixon was one of the central figures in Chicago blues, the author of dozens of standards that had been recorded by major artists across 2 decades, and a composer whose catalog was among the most commercially exploited in the history of the genre. He filed a lawsuit against Led Zeppelin after the similarities between Whole Lotta Love and You Need Love became widely noted in the music press. The case was settled out of court in 1985, with Dixon receiving both a financial settlement and a formal songwriting credit on the track. This was far from an isolated situation for Led Zeppelin. The band faced multiple legal challenges throughout their career related to uncredited borrowing from blues musicians. Dixon also successfully pursued action against the band over Bring It On Home, and the estate of songwriter Ann Bredon later settled with the band over Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You. Spirit guitarist Randy California also claimed for years that the opening guitar figure of Stairway to Heaven had been taken from a 1968 Spirit instrumental, a case that eventually went to trial in 2016 before being resolved in Led Zeppelin's favor. The pattern of drawing from existing blues recordings without attribution was consistent across Led Zeppelin's early catalog, and the settlements that followed represented formal legal acknowledgments of those debts. Dixon's original compositions were foundational to the sound on which Led Zeppelin built their early reputation, and the eventual recognition of his contributions, though delayed by years of legal proceedings, stands as one of the more significant copyright outcomes in rock history. Number 2, La Bamba by Richie Valens. Richie Valens recorded La Bamba in 1958, and the song became one of the earliest rock and roll recordings to feature Spanish-language lyrics on mainstream American radio. It reached number 22 on the Billboard Hot 100 and gave Valens a distinctive presence in the early rock era that set him apart from most of his contemporaries. His death in the February 1959 plane crash that also killed Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper cut short a career that had only just begun. La Bamba is a traditional Mexican folk song rooted in the son jarocho musical tradition of the state of Veracruz. It is believed to date back several centuries, with some scholars tracing versions of it to the 17th century. The melody and basic structure had existed long before Valens encountered it, passed down through generations of folk performance in southern Mexico. What Valens contributed was a rock and roll arrangement, electric guitar, a driving rhythm section, and the energy of the emerging idiom, applied to a composition he had not written and had not authored in any original sense. Because the song existed as traditional folk music with no registered copyright holder at the time of Valens' recording, no legal action was possible or pursued. The right situation around traditional folk material in the 1950s was largely unresolved across the music industry, and Valens was hardly unique in recording traditional songs without formal attribution. However, the broader conversation around La Bamba speaks to a practice deeply embedded in early rock and roll. The commercial adaptation of folk and traditional material drawn from Black and Latino communities, often without attribution or compensation to the cultures that had preserved and developed those musical traditions over generations. Valens' version went on to eclipse all prior recordings of the song in terms of cultural visibility, and the majority of listeners who know it today remain unaware that what they consider a Ritchie Valens original is in fact a centuries-old traditional composition he adapted rather than created. Number 1. Tutti Frutti and the Legacy of Little Richard. Tutti Frutti was recorded and released by Little Richard in 1955, just before the decade this list covers. But its influence, and the enormous wave of imitations it generated, defined the first half of the 1960s so completely that it earns the top position here for the role it played in what followed. The song itself had an unusual origin. The original version contained lyrics considered far too explicit for commercial radio, and songwriter Dorothy Labostri was brought into the recording session to rewrite them in a matter of minutes. The cleaned-up version that reached radio stations was a compromise between Little Richard's raw energy and what the market of the mid-1950s would tolerate, and even in that softened form, it landed like nothing that had come before it. Pat Boone released a cover version of Tutti Frutti in early 1956 that outsold Little Richard's original on the mainstream pop charts. Boone's version changed almost nothing musically. The structure, tempo, and arrangement were direct copies of the original. The difference was in delivery. Boone's smoother vocal style made the song more accessible to mainstream white radio audiences, and his version reached commercial spaces that Little Richard's had not been allowed to penetrate. This practice, white artists re-recording black artists' hit songs for wider commercial release, was known as covering, and it was both widespread and accepted industry practice in the 1950s, continuing well into the early 1960s. The system had no formal legal obstacle and served the financial interests of major labels too well for there to be any industry-wide pressure to change it. Boone's Tutti Frutti is the most direct example, but throughout the early 1960s, dozens of artists built careers substantially on arrangements and vocal approaches that trace directly back to Little Richard's innovations in rhythm, phrasing, and energy. The Beatles themselves named Little Richard as a primary influence, and Paul McCartney in particular studied Richard's vocal delivery with great care. The structure and feel of their early recordings owe a great deal to the template he had established. Other British invasion acts, and including the Rolling Stones and the Animals, were similarly rooted in the American rhythm and blues tradition that Little Richard had helped define. Little Richard received minimal financial benefit from the enormous commercial success that his innovations generated for others. His compositions were foundational to the shape of 1960s popular music, yet the mechanisms of the industry at the time ensured that much of the profit flowed elsewhere. The story of Tutti Frutti and its imitators is, in many ways, the story of how popular music in the early 1960s was built, on foundations laid by artists who were neither adequately credited nor adequately compensated for what they created. Little Richard continued performing and speaking about these injustices for the rest of his life, ensuring that the record, at least in part, was set straight. Music has always been a conversation across time. Artists responding to artists, melodies echoing other melodies. The 1960s were no exception. Some of the stories on this list involved unconscious memory, others were open acknowledgments of debt, and some ended up settled in court. A few of the artists involved spoke openly about what they had borrowed. Others spent years denying it. Some of the original composers received credit and compensation eventually, others never did. What makes these cases worth knowing about is not that they diminish the songs. Most of the recordings on this list are genuinely great pieces of music, and nothing about their histories changes that. What they do is remind us that creativity rarely happens in isolation. Every artist who picked up a guitar in the 1960s was building on something that came before, and not all of them were equally careful or equally honest about where those foundations had come from. The blues musicians, the girl group composers, the folk traditions, the rhythm and blues singers who never got the credit their work deserved. Their fingerprints are all over the decade's most celebrated records. The songs remain beloved, but the full story of how they came to exist is a lot more complicated and a lot more interesting than most people ever hear. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe. There's plenty more music history where this came from.